Hi, hello, everybody. So welcome to the second day of April. What we've got going on today is we're going to be moving into really what is looking, I guess, at the second half of the civil rights movement proper. We're going to start the day by talking about what becomes kind of like the next thing on the list for the African American community of trying to make a change. And it's going to focus on another inalienable right of citizens of the United States, which is the right to vote. We're going to talk a little bit about what the fight against that discrimination looks like. We're going to see some other approaches and some different things. This is just one more way to fight the same issue, which is inequality in our country. Once we finish chatting about the voting rights aspect, we're going to start discussing the major difference between fighting for civil rights in the South as compared to fighting for civil rights in the North. This is a regional divide that has existed pre-Civil War and has continued post-Civil War. And most of what we've been discussing has been either in a southern setting or a national one. So we're going to be focusing up into the north, getting a little closer to home, as I always like to try and do within all of our units. At the end of today, I've got some work to be completed discussion for you guys overall. So your notebook should be out, and we're going to keep on talking. Now, what we're going to be focused on and what we're going to be talking about, like I said, is fighting for the right to vote, or to at least be able to, again, take advantage of this right that African Americans were given, but again, it was kept from them in a lot of different ways. So, in the summer of 64, we're going to see that different civil rights organizations are going to start to turn their attention more actively towards this kind of change. Of course, the NAACP and the SCLC, they've been doing a really nice job of demonstrating inequality and discrimination, and things have been changing, but a lot of it is tenuous, or it doesn't feel like it's going fast enough. So the idea of helping African Americans utilize their right to vote is something that makes a lot of sense. If you can participate in the process of making laws and selecting leaders, you have more control over your own life in a democratic country like our own. So Freedom Summer, as it gets referred to, is a project that is set up basically by, again, various different groups in the South to try and get as many African Americans registered to vote as possible. They're going to focus for the most part in Mississippi. Just knowing that in those in Mississippi and Alabama are some of the most segregated and kept down African American communities that are out there. Freedom Summer is an interesting, I guess, project, because by the time we get to the mid 1960s, so many different things have happened to either convince people that they need to help or to turn people away and say that this is just causing more harm than it's causing any kind of help, I suppose. But Freedom Summer is going to be one of the last big positive changes, I would say. A lot of young, again, baby boomers who are coming of age are going to join up. We're going to get recruited and going to volunteer to come down into the South and try and get people, again, registered, so on and so forth. Most of the initial volunteers in Freedom Summer are actually, they're white Americans who are hoping to try and see some change here. About 1/3 of all the volunteers are going to be women, which is, of course, again, something that makes sense, I suppose, in the long run. And again, they especially recognize that being kept from able to vote is a huge deterrent of being able to fairly represent yourself in a nation. Knowing that women only at that point had the right to vote for, oh my goodness, just thinking about that kind of throws me, but only about, again, looks like 45 years at that point. So again, we're going to see that this, like any of the other demonstrations or protests that have taken place, turns out to, again, the reaction is usually very violent and intense. So it's a much more dangerous task than just going and knocking on doors and helping people fill out some paperwork. It is going to result in a handful of different unfortunate lives lost, people being beaten, businesses being burned down who are, again, supportive, or they even talk positively about those people out there trying to register people to vote. And This is again, one of those situations that even if they do manage to successfully register African Americans, there's still a lot of obstacles that they have to overcome. Remember that the last time we talked about voting in the South, a lot of states had come up with different loopholes to be able to work around the 15th Amendment, which is the Voting Rights Amendment, specifically thinking about things like literacy tests, poll taxes, which make the ability to vote even more out of reach for people, specifically those who they don't want to be overall. Um, uh, what we're going to see here happen is because, again, there is so many obstacles to getting African Americans to participate, and historically, African Americans to this day have been low participation in elections. Is that they decide to create their own political party that. Sometimes, when African Americans could vote, they didn't feel like either the Republican or the Democratic candidate really spoke for them, really had their back. So they're going to try and actively create their own representation in the government. So the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party is that particular item. They wanted to give power back to the black population in a way that a lot of the other political parties were refusing to do so, including the official Democratic Party at that time, LBJ, who had taken over from JFK, of course, is going to be in campaigning mode during the summer of '64, trying to get himself ready and elected officially as president. He never gives public support to the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party. He was really worried that if he did, that he would alienate big voter groups like the Southern Democrats that he relied on. And he ultimately ends up giving kind of lackluster compromises to the MFDP, and they're definitely not impressed with him. He does, of course, have a lot of plans, and he is going to be known as the civil rights president with the types of laws that he passes. But this moment is not a shining one in LBJ's association with civil rights. So, what we're going to see happen here is we're going to, like some of the other demonstrations and items that we've talked about, we're going to talk about a specific situation. So, over the course of Freedom Summer, a lot of, again, individuals go and they're trying to get people organized. But when the summer is done, those volunteers are gone. The organizations are going to pick up the slack and keep pushing, kind of canvassing through various different states in the South. And in Alabama, we're going to see that the SCLC and SNCC are going to be working together to keep trying to get voters registered. Just because the presidential election of '64 has come and gone doesn't mean that there aren't a lot of other opportunities for African Americans to vote and participate in the process. So in '65, MOK and the SCLC and SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, are going to be in Selma, Alabama. Selma is, again, just another city in the state of Alabama, which had very strict, again, laws and rules about segregation. And during the course of this canvassing, a young man is going to be killed while he is trying to get people registered, and nothing happens. Again, there is no investigation. There's no one held accountable. So Martin Luther King Jr. is going to take this opportunity to try and bring attention to this one more aspect of how African Americans are treated so differently in the United States. If a young white man had been killed in that moment, they would have had nothing but full coverage and, again, all of this different kind of investigation and due course of law and stuff. But African Americans, it's not. It's like it's swept under the rug. So the SLC is going to organize a march that is going to go from Selma, Alabama to Montgomery. This is a big march. Again, they're going to put together about 600 people in a not a very large amount of time, and they're going to march out on March 7th, and they're going to just walk walk to Montgomery, Alabama, and well, this goes like a lot of the different demonstrations in the South have gone, and it's going to be met with extreme violence. And the whole thing is captured on TV. By 65, the news stations know that when Martin Luther King Jr. and his organization are putting together a demonstration that they want to be there. So there is live footage of these white, again, Southerners who don't approve of this march, don't want it to happen, and they're going to forcibly try and stop these people from walking. The again footage and the pictures are vivid, I would say. Again, we've got lots of imagery of people being sprayed with high power again hoses. You've got people who are being attacked by dogs. It's very intense. This reaction, because of it was so well covered, this is going to force LBJ's hand a little bit as the new sitting president in the United States. So when MLK and his group have recovered enough, they're going to set out again on March 21st. So again, a few weeks later, and they're going to have 25,000 people show up in support of this march. And even LBJ is going to provide protection to the marchers to make sure that they can fulfill their demonstration all the way to the end. The other sort of impact that comes out of this is going to be LBJ pushing through the Voting Rights Act of 1965. This is obviously a federal government law that is created similar to the Civil Rights Act of 64, excuse me, to try and again eliminate the need for protests and demonstrations, to eliminate the need for all of these people to be putting themselves in harm's way to draw attention. The Voting Rights Act is going to eliminate voter literacy tests, so people aren't going to be able to take advantage of individuals because of their ability to read and write. It's going to also enable federal examiners and not locals to register voters. So it's an attempt to try and take out some of the unfair treatment overall. Selma is a really interesting moment in the civil rights movement. As you can see here, there's two links on this slide. One is a documentary about the anniversary of this march. I would definitely encourage you guys to take a watch. It's not very long. The other is the music video for the again Academy Award nominated film about this particular moment in history, Selma. I definitely would suggest it if you're interested in this time period at all. Give it a watch, try and find it. You get time on your hands. I know that's the case, to see how this plays out overall. So now what we're going to be doing is we're going to be moving our discussions from the South, where we have been, for the most part, very much rooted, somewhere else. So normally, if we were in class together, this would be an activity where I would have you guys taking a look at these pictures, a really close look as best as you can, and trying to tell me where and when these pictures are taken. If you take a few moments just to look, you can maybe pull out some clues. It really depends on how closely you look at this and how familiar you are with this overall. So take a moment, take a couple again seconds to look, and try and come up with an idea in your head of where are these pictures taking place and when about do you think that they were. Okay, so if you pause me, great. If not, I'm going to tell you. So both of these pictures were taken in Milwaukee in 1967-68. This large building in the background and the picture of the left is the Milwaukee City Hall. If you were to go downtown there, where these two gentlemen are looking, one closest to us in the frame is going to be, again, Ziegler, the mayor at that time. If you look out that direction, it's towards the river, and then the new Bucks Arena is that direction. The picture on the right, the clue that maybe you would have gotten if you look really closely at the shirts that these guys are wearing, it says Milwaukee NAACP on the left-hand side, those gentlemen right there. And as far as timing goes, that's really just comes down to where we're at in our chronological discussions here. So let's talk about why these pictures of the South or the North look so similar to those of the South. And we haven't even talked about them. So, when it comes right down to it, you have to understand, and I've tried to bring this up more than once at this point, that segregation and discrimination was not just happening in the southern states. It's definitely something that the African American community was experiencing in the North. It was different. It felt different. It looked different. The experience overall was different. And to get technical with it, the difference that we see here is again these two very fancy terms. We've got de facto and de jure. De facto segregation is the separation of people by practicing custom, and de jure is by law. So, what we're seeing here is that the North has a lot of segregation, but there aren't necessarily official laws saying that this is where blacks go, this is where whites go, this is the jobs that blacks have, these are the jobs that whites have, so on and so forth. Where in the South, there were a lot of laws. Jim Crow, again, all of that, it created a set of laws that the organizations and people could look at and be like, well, we need to change that. The idea of changing someone's attitude, their belief that whites should have the best jobs and live in the best homes and have the most power, convincing them to give that up is a lot more difficult than trying to get them to share seats on a bus. The changing of an attitude, something that is ingrained into someone from day one, is a huge undertaking, where changing laws, if you've got logic on your side, you can do that. It's definitely much more accomplishable. So the de facto segregation that we're going to be trying to come up against during the civil rights movement starts developing in after World War II, when you had that big migration of African Americans into northern cities. Overall, there was this natural sort of, this is where you fit, this is where you belong. And then, of course, after World War II, you had white flight. You had all those people moving out into the suburbs, taking with them their money and their, again, basically the tax base of cities. And cities that now are left behind, and they've got all the people who are there are stuck in that cycle of poverty, and they don't have enough to be able to live their lives in a reasonable way. But those people who are living in the cities are still seeing all of those white individuals working there because they commute into a day after day. The African Americans who are left behind are regulated into the worst and most worn down parts of the city. And there's really two things or two elements that help, or again, I don't know, that dictate this. One is redlining, and it's not bolded, but you should definitely write it down. It's going to be a key term for you guys. And like I said, this is something that is not a written law, but there is no law saying it's not allowed. So it enforces segregation. It makes it possible. So redlining is the big one, especially when we talk about Milwaukee. Tomorrow, we're going to do an activity with this. Redlining is the process which banks will physically draw onto a map lines where these are neighborhoods where they refuse to lend money to purchase property there or to even improve the property within those boundaries. And of course, all the neighborhoods that are redlined during this time are going to be where minorities live. Their banks are unwilling to give money to help improve those places overall. And that's, again, it should sound very shady, I suppose, because that's what it is. But again, there's no out and out law or again word in that overall process that says that this is African Americans are not going to get money to be able to improve their lives, but it is what's happening by practice, by custom. Filtering is another, again, process that is happening during this time of basically single family homes being broken into multiple low income apartments. And then landlords, instead of paying money to upkeep, to keep these buildings nice, they just let them deteriorate until they are left abandoned. That's a lot less money than having to try and keep things good. And it's a process that it's disproportionate to the neighborhoods where African Americans live. The other sorts of experiences that Blacks and other minorities are going to have in cities as all of the white population moves to the suburbs is it's just unfair. In Like I said, this is not they're not laws necessarily. It's more or less these people are going to just do this because they think it is right and it's fine. Well, one is that there won't again white landlords are going to set unfair rent. Again, they get to pick and choose, and they'll change it based off of each individual person or family that tries to live somewhere, which is very tough. Of course, we know that African Americans already are being regulated into the worst kinds of jobs. They don't have the money to be able to, again, change their lot. And even if they wanted to go in to get money, the banks wouldn't give them anything. There were a lot of housing and health violations in the low income homes that are being broken down from single family. And again, it just was being swept under the rug. It's nothing that they paid attention to. And then there is the police harassment. Even though most whites had moved out into the suburbs, the police forces stayed very white throughout this time period. And of course, the police departments, with the losing all of that tax support, are underfunded, they're understaffed, and the issues that arise within these neighborhoods, poverty breeds a lot of different things: discontent, crime, again, violence, all of that stuff. And the police forces are going to start to make unfortunately long lasting connections between these neighborhoods and the people who live there, and violence and the things that put themselves into danger. And the police harassment in northern cities and cities in general against Blacks it's going to be exceedingly unfair. They're not there to protect them, they're there to keep them in line. And that's not a great way for police to operate, that's for sure. So that's it for notes. I know it's kind of a lot, it's kind of dense, but it's important to understand that there's still a lot to be addressed with the civil rights movement. We've had some good positive changes, of course, with laws that have been addressed, but there are still some very huge hurdles to overcome here. And these hurdles, as they rise higher and higher, are going to change the civil rights movement. They've had success in the South and with those laws, they're going to again grind to a halt, and that becomes very frustrating, and it's going to change a lot of how things move forward. So with that said and done, work to be completed. You're going to have another lecture tomorrow. Please make sure that you check that out. You have got to finish by tomorrow the letter from a Birmingham jail, the active reading activity that is on Classroom for you guys. You're going to be doing some highlighting